Hi everyone, welcome to this session. In the previous session, we have derived aggregate demand curve from ISLM model. In this session, we will continue our discussion using this aggregate demand curve and then see what's going to happen to the aggregate demand curve when there is increase in government expenditure, that means fiscal policy, and also due to changes in monetary policy. And subsequently, if we will also discuss some of the related concepts called lags in policy effects. So, before that, let me start with the aggregate demand curve. As you can see that this is the one that we have derived in the previous session. That means this is the downward sloping aggregate demand curve when price level changes. So, that means this is the demand curve, exactly this YD is equal to M naught that we have derived in the previous session. So, in this case, to begin with this, assume that the initial equilibrium position is this one, that means LM, money supply is M naught and the price level is P naught. Again, then you know that if we assume fixed price, when money supplies increase from M naught to money supply is increased to M naught to M1, but the money supply, but the price level remaining constant, then you can say that the curve will be shifting rightwards and the new equilibrium position is going to be B. So, in this case, when we assume price level is same, then actually the aggregate demand curve is going to shift from A to B. So, in this case, what we have seen that due to an expansionary monetary policy, the aggregate demand curve has shifted from A to B, then this position, that means from Y naught to Y epsilon 1. So, this is the increase in aggregate demand, right, increase in del Y. Then the issue is that at the given price level P naught, the aggregate supply, the firms, the producers of goods and services, at this price level you can see that aggregate demand is this much, right, this much is aggregate demand is there, del Y denoted with here the aggregate demand part, this much. But you know, at this price, look at the firms, they are not willing to increase output, they are not willing to supply this much output, the del Y. Del Y is the aggregate demand, change in aggregate demand, but this del Y, it should be also matched, this is aggregate demand, it also should be matched with aggregate supply. But the producers, firms, they are not willing to change, they are already at equilibrium, they are not willing to increase output equivalent to this del Y, and they will do only at a higher price. So, then actually the firms, they gradually increase the price, then the price level will increase from P naught to P1. So, then you can say that means they are having an upward sloping supply curve. So, when we are having fixed price level of P naught, at that time the implicit assumption of aggregate supply curve, that this YS is a horizontal curve, a flat curve, that is the assumption. But in the ISLM model, when we relax that assumption and when we make the price level is changing, that means this is no more constant, it is a flexible price, then in this case we are going to see that the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So, the Keynesians, they later on agree, they also derive an upward. In the early Keynesian, they believed in upward, perfectly elastic, that means a horizontal aggregate supply curve, but later on they revised this one and they agreed with an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, because here you can see that there is increase in aggregate demand, right, that del Y this much, but firms will produce the matching amount, they are willing to produce only at the higher price. When the price increase, that means when the price increase, then you can see that this is where they are willing to produce, that means at a higher price only they are willing to produce more. So, when there is increase in price level, then you can see that when price increase from P naught to P1, then that means the real money supply further decrease, right, with the real money supply decrease, that means the LM curve is shifting leftward. So, that means here the P naught, but the P1, the price level increase. Now the money supply is the new money supply M1, but this is not changed, this remaining same now, but the price level has increased. This is nothing but the curve is shifting from right to left. That means the new equilibrium position is going to be C. That means when price is changing, when the price is increasing, then we have seen in the previous diagram that the movement will be along the demand curve. That means the movement along the demand curve, new equilibrium position is going to be C. So that means the new level of the increase in aggregate demand was this much was the increase in aggregate demand, but actually when the price level increase, then the output will be produced, the new equilibrium position is going to be here, and the actual increase in aggregate output is going to be only this much, right. So this is the new equilibrium position. Similarly, what we have seen in the previous this diagram here is that when there is an increase in money supply, you can see that aggregate demand increase, but when firm will respond to this increase aggregate demand only by increasing price. So as a result, you can see that when the price will increase, there will be slight decline in aggregate demand as well, and the firm will be producing output in the corresponding matching amount of output, but not at the full increase in aggregate demand, but at a lower level. But overall we can see that there is increase in aggregate supply as well. And similarly, when there is increase in government expenditure, here also you can assume the same relationship. That means increase in government expenditure and expansionary fiscal policy will shift the aggregate demand curve here. The equilibrium position will be A to B. But if we assume, and again what we discussed in the previous slide, firms are willing to meet this additional demand only at a higher price. When the price level increase from P0 to P1, but the money supply remaining constant, then you know that LN curve will be shifting leftwards. So that means at a flexible price, that means we are moving along the demand curve. That in the new demand curve, you can see the new demand curve we are moving along. So this is going to be the new equilibrium output, that where at this position this is the new Y aggregate supply equal to finally del YAD. So in this diagram and previous diagram, we can see that increase an expansionary fiscal policy and an expansionary monetary policy can increase our aggregate demand and as well as aggregate supply in the economy. That means if if an economy at a recessionary stage, in the short run monetary and fiscal policy can be used to increase level of economic activity. First the effect will be on aggregate demand, then subsequent effect it will be on aggregate supply. So that means in short we can see that fiscal and monetary policy can be used to revive economy or economic activity in the short run, especially when economy is at recession. Some more related topics here, because since we discussed that by using the diagrams, especially using ISLM, we have seen that increase in government expenditure, that the expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy is going to benefit economy by increase in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Right, but the way in graphically it looks like very so simple, but in the real world it may not be, it's not that much easy and straightforward and smooth. So there are several lags in real macroeconomic economy. So let's discuss that one by one, and then let's comment on the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy to increase aggregate demand and aggregate supply. There are several lags. One of the lags is called the information lags, because in the ISLM model assume that policymakers see what is happening in the economy and can instantly alter policy to fix any problem, because it was so easy for us to use the ISLM framework to see that okay, when increase in government expenditure, aggregate demand is going to increase and aggregate supply is also going to increase, right. So that means assume we can see policy makers can see what is happening in the economy, but in the real world this is not true. There is information lag. For example, a delay between a change in the economy and knowledge of that change. And especially this monetary policy and fiscal policy, these policies have been used in order to revive the economy, in order to restore equilibrium in the macroeconomy, especially when the economy is at recession. Right, when the economy is at a recessionary stage, in order to revive the economy, these policy tools are used in the short run. Then the question is, how do we know that? Are we in a recession right now, or are we at present, are we in a recession or not? For example, in the US, it is the business cycle dating committee within the National Bureau of Economic Research. It has the responsibility of determining when a recession begins and when it ends. They make the formal announcement about the recession business cycle. Right, so that means they also do research based on the data and research in information. They make they announce that at present economy is going through recession. But by the time when we come to know whether maybe there can be a lag, maybe recession might have started almost 6 months back, right? That means already the time is lapsed. So that means the recognition, the information lag, whether what is the current stage where the economy is at. So that means again how we determine whether the economy is at a toe or at a boom, peak stage, a recession or at a boom. One of the two variables that we use, one is actual output, that is the GDP. Another one is the potential GDP, potential output. So the macroeconomic goal is to keep output, the actual output, as close to potential output as possible. But the question here is, what is potential output? Again, potential output we identify using macroeconomic model, using the trend information. So if we are not so clear whether what is the potential output and what is the potential output in this economy, if you are not so clear, using an expansionary monetary policy above potential output will cause inflation. Suppose if the policy makers use contractionary policy when the economy is actually below potential output, if you are not able to clearly understand whether we are below the potential output or above the potential output, it creates unnecessary shock in the economy. For example, without knowing that economy's potential output is below the actual output, and if they use contractionary monetary policy, actually at that time it should be the expansionary policy. So in contrast to that, if they use contractionary policy, then it will create unnecessary unemployment. Already economy is moving towards unemployment and recession, then in a contractionary monetary policy if they use, it would further lead to unnecessary unemployment. Actually, some of the debate in macroeconomics was that in 1930s during Great Depression, that time the central bank has used contractionary monetary policy instead of an expansionary monetary policy. As a debatable issue. Another lag is policy implementation lag. Suppose the economy is at full employment, it is affected by a negative aggregate demand disturbance. Obviously, it reduces equilibrium level of income below full employment. So there is no advance warning of disturbance, so no policy action taken in anticipation of its occurrence. So in this case, suppose there is no policy implementation, there was a lag. Once suppose the recognition lag has already happened, in the information lag, okay, that has been addressed, but after that the policy implementation lag, if there is a delay from the policy makers to respond, that means no policy action is taken in anticipation of its occurrence, that also can affect the monetary and fiscal policy. So makers must decide, should they respond to the disturbance? If they take suppose 5 to 6 months for example, so in that case 5 to 6 months suppose if they take, then obviously is going to affect the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy. And if so, if they respond, how should they respond? Or whether monetary policy or fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, how much amount, what is the magnitude of fiscal policy, all matters. Even monetary policy also, what is the magnitude of the intervention, all matters. So in order to the policy implementation lag, that the delay between the time policy maker recognize the need for policy action and when the policy is actually instituted, the policy implementation lag, we can classify it into two broad categories. one is called inside lags and other one is outside lags. So policy making is a process. It takes time to recognize and implement policy action and takes time for an action to work its way through the economy. So each steps involves delay or lags, that one is inside lags and the other one is outside lags. So let's discuss one by one these lags. So coming to the inside lags, one is called recognition lags. That means the time period it takes to undertake a policy action, right. So the time, suppose if there is the lag is negative, the disturbance is predicted and appropriate action is considered before it occurs, then it's fine. But mostly there is positive lag, so that means period that elapses between the time a disturbance occurs and time the policy makers recognize that action is required. So lags typically is positive. So that's affect. By the time economy will be already at a recessionary stage, then it won't make, the policy won't make much impact. And second inside lag is called decision lag. Once they recognize the problem, then the decision, the delay between the recognition of the need for action and the policy decision. This is another lag, was called the inside lag, that's called decision lag. It actually differs between monetary and fiscal policy. For example, in the US, fiscal policy it has several large implementation lag because policy must be formulated and legislation passed by Congress and signed by the president. In contrast to this, monetary policy is mainly done by the FOMC. They meet 8 times in a year, so that in emergency they meet immediately, so that they have much shorter implementation lag because FOMC decides monetary policy and implements it immediately. Similarly, in India, the RBI, the Monetary Policy Committee, decide the monetary policy. So there is the inside lag, the decision lag is much less when it comes to monetary policy as compared to fiscal policy. Then comes action lag, the lag between policy decision and its implementation. Also differs between monetary and fiscal policy because monetary policy makes typically act immediately, but fiscal policy actions are less rapid. Then comes after this inside lags, another lag is called outside lag. Outside lag is more theoretical in fact, because the thing is that the time it takes a policy measures to work its way through the economy. That means inside lags are discrete, but outside lags are typically distributed lags. For example, once a policy action has been taken, its effects on the economy are spread out over time. So the immediate impacts may be small, but other effects occur later. So let us look at in the case of monetary and fiscal policy. In the case of monetary policy, the outside lag initially impacts investment while interest rate not directly income. So we have seen when there is an expansionary monetary policy, it would create portfolio disequilibrium in among the households, and as a result there will be decrease in the rate of interest, and as a result there is increase in investment. Then finally is going to impact aggregate demand, right. So that means aggregate demand ultimately affected through changes in interest rate and changes in investment. So that means there is a delay. But when it comes to fiscal policy, though there is less inside lag, there are lots of inside lags, but the outside lag is very less because we have seen that fiscal policy directly impact aggregate demand. So outside lag is less when it comes to fiscal policy. So we have seen that monetary policy there are more outside lag because the channel, the transmission mechanism through which it affects, it takes a longer time. For example, Friedman, the Nobel Prize winner and the well-known monetarist economist, to his statement I am quoting here, that changes in money supply will have a strong effect on income, but there is a lag with the bulk of the effect occurring only after 6 to 18 months. Right. So at the same time, again, this actually the predict size and all, it is very difficult to predict as well, because Friedman and other monetarists believe that we don't know enough about the economy, how it works. So about the fiscal policy, its impact is direct, that means it directly affects, so there is shorter outside lags than monetary policy. Similarly, also concern is there is expectations and reactions in the economy. So that not only that the policy makers, once the policy makers address the inside lags and come up with the fiscal or monetary policy. So in addition, there are clearly policymakers do not know what expectation firms and consumers have. Maybe if they come up with an expansionary monetary policy, by the time already, suppose what if firms and consumers already anticipated that there is a expansionary monetary policy is coming. So using the rational expectation, we have seen that economy might have already adjusted to that. Then this policy effect is not going to make any impact. And clearly government doesn't know the true model of the economy, so they most often work with the econometric models of the economy in estimating the effects of policy changes. So really economic model is a statistical description of the economy, that means only some part of it. And similarly, there is uncertainty. Policymakers can go wrong in using active stabilization policy due to uncertainty about the expectation of firms and consumers, difficulty in forecasting disturbance, lack of knowledge of the true nature of economy. And there is in macroeconomy, there is huge debate between different schools of economic thought and differential policy impact. So in this way, the group led by Milton Friedman, monetarists, they believe that there should be a rule-based monetary policy, not responding as according to the crisis. Instead, there should be, for example, Friedman advocated for a simple monetary rule, that the constant rate rule. That means money supply should be, when the economy is growing, suppose GDP is growing in an economy, for example, 5%. The money supply also should be growing by 5%. That means constant rate rule. In contrast to this, that means they are actually suggesting that there should be confined to the making money supply grow at a constant rate, not responding to recession and boom. That actually Milton Friedman is not suggesting for that, he is supporting for a rule base. But Keynesians, they suggest that because this monetary and fiscal policy, they mainly support this one for as a short run policy to revive the economy. They suggest it to use it as an activist policy or discretionary policy. So in determining how policymakers should operate, policymakers must answer several questions. Should policymakers actively try to offset shock? If yes, should responses be pre-committed to specific rules, that means rule based or discretionary or activist based, or should policymakers work on a case by case basis? So in addition to the factors that we discussed, there are some other factors as well that also affect the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy. One of it is, for example, the banks reluctant to send. So we have seen that if there is an expansionary monetary policy, suppose when increase in money supply, when central bank come up with an open market operations and thereby increasing liquidity with the banking system, with the banks, suppose then as a result banks liquidity increases. So what we can see that as a result, when the bank's liquidity increases, and then the expected further transmission is that banks will be lending this money in the economy. Bank is the channel who is injecting this money into the economy. But what happened, because we have discussed in the previous sessions that the default risk, this is another issue with the most banks, because of the riskiness of the borrowers, even in their liquidity has increased, or even they are getting cheap credit from the bank, the central bank, it is not necessary that they will lend to the economy. That means another situation in which monetary policy is powerless to alter the economy is that reluctance of the banks to lend to the general public and to the firms. So that means it will break down the monetary transmission mechanism. So despite lower interest rates and increased demand for investment, banks may be unwilling to make loans necessary for the investment purchases. So because if they have lots of NPA, for example, if banks made prior bad loans that are not repaid, so they may become reluctant to make more and more loans despite there is increase in demand. So if the risk level is very high in the economy, if they anticipate high default risk in the economy, so they prefer, banks prefer not to lend the additional money. So then they will be putting their money, for example, if they get more money, the liquidity increases, they will be, for example, putting this money in the investing their money in the government security, etc. They won't be lending in the economy. So in addition to that, there are some other factors, the soundness of economic and political institutions and systems in the economy, that also affects the policy effectiveness. Because the transmission channels that we had discussed in this session and previous sessions, we have seen that the expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy, finally, for example, expansionary monetary policy, we have seen that when there is increase in money supply, the rate of interest decrease, then the cost of production for the firms decrease, because rate of interest decrease means nothing but decrease in the cost of borrowing fund, right. So that because of the decrease in cost of borrowing, cost of production decrease, but it's not necessary that the firms will be able to respond adequately, appropriately. It also depends upon their managerial and technical skill, as well as other support that they are getting from the other economic and political institutions. That means the support from policy makers, the institutions, the economic institutions and political institutions, legal institutions in the country, all this should support for them to expand their production investment. So that it also depends overall economic systems soundness, as well as managerial and technical skills of the firm, because they need to acquire new machines and plants. So that means there should be timely availability of skilled labor as well if they want to expand their production process. So in short, what we have discussed in this session was that actually there are several lags in the economy, where we discuss coming mainly with the inside lags and outside lag. Then we discussed this one with the monetary and fiscal policy. Then we saw that there is a variation when it comes to inside and outside lag in the case of fiscal and monetary policy. Thank you so much. See you in the next session.